Question 1. Regulatory review indicates a potential safety concern has been identified with a widely used medical device. The risk management team has preliminary data suggesting a possible malfunction under specific operating conditions, but a definitive root cause analysis is ongoing. What is the most appropriate communication strategy to initiate immediately? Option A. Issue a broad public statement detailing the preliminary findings and outlining immediate precautionary measures for users, while concurrently initiating formal reporting to regulatory authorities and engaging with key distributors. Option B. Wait for the complete root cause analysis and the development of a final corrective action plan before communicating any information to external parties. Option C. Inform only the regulatory authorities about the preliminary findings and await their guidance on further communication. Option D. Disseminate an internal memo to all employees about the potential issue, instructing them not to discuss it externally until further notice. The correct answer is A. Issue a broad public statement detailing the preliminary findings and outlining immediate precautionary measures for users, while concurrently initiating formal reporting to regulatory authorities and engaging with key distributors. Explanation. Scenario analysis. The scenario presents a critical challenge for a medical device manufacturer, a potential safety issue requiring immediate communication to users and regulatory bodies. The professional challenge lies in balancing the urgency of informing stakeholders about a potential risk with the need for accurate, verified information. Premature or inaccurate communication can lead to panic, loss of trust, and regulatory noncompliance. Conversely, delayed communication can expose patients to harm and damage the company's reputation. The need for swift, yet precise, action under pressure is paramount. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach emphasizes a structured, multifaceted communication strategy that prioritizes accuracy, transparency, and regulatory adherence. This involves 1. Internal verification, ensuring all information is factually correct and has undergone rigorous internal review. This aligns with the fundamental principle of risk management to act based on evidence. 2. Stakeholder identification, proactively identifying all relevant parties, healthcare professionals, patients, distributors, regulatory authorities, and tailoring communication to their specific needs and understanding. This is crucial for effective risk mitigation and compliance with reporting obligations. 3. Clear and concise messaging, developing messages that are unambiguous, easy to understand, and directly address the potential risk and recommended actions. This minimizes misinterpretation and ensures appropriate responses. 4. Timely reporting, adhering to regulatory timelines for reporting adverse events or safety concerns. This is a non-negotiable legal and ethical requirement. 5. Proactive engagement, establishing channels for feedback and questions, demonstrating a commitment to ongoing dialogue and support. This builds trust and facilitates ongoing risk management. This comprehensive approach best represents professional practice because it integrates risk assessment findings with effective communication protocols, ensuring both patient safety and regulatory compliance, as mandated by the principles of ISO 971. Incorrect approaches analysis, an approach that prioritizes immediate, broad dissemination of unverified information without internal validation, is professionally unacceptable. This fails to meet the fundamental requirement of acting on accurate risk assessment data. It can lead to widespread misinformation, unnecessary alarm, and potential legal repercussions for false or misleading statements. Another incorrect approach would be to delay communication until a definitive root cause is identified and a complete solution is implemented. While thoroughness is important, this can violate regulatory reporting timelines and expose patients to ongoing risk if the issue is safety critical. The ethical and regulatory imperative is to inform stakeholders about potential risks as soon as they are identified and reasonably understood, even if the full solution is still in development. A strategy that focuses solely on internal communication or communication with only a subset of stakeholders, e.g., only regulatory bodies, while neglecting direct communication with users, healthcare professionals, and patients, is also flawed. This creates information silos and fails to adequately protect those directly affected by the device's potential issue, violating the principle of transparency and user safety inherent in risk management. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the identified risk and its potential impact. This involves consulting the risk management file and relevant ISO 971 guidance. The next step is to assess the urgency and scope of the communication required, considering regulatory reporting obligations and the potential for patient harm. A cross-functional team including risk management, regulatory affairs, quality assurance, and communications should convene to develop a communication plan. This plan must detail the target audience, key messages, communication channels, and timelines. Regular review and updates to the communication strategy should be incorporated as new information becomes available. This systematic, evidence-based, and stakeholder-centric approach ensures that communication is both effective and compliant. Question 2. The evaluation methodology shows a manufacturer has conducted a comprehensive risk analysis for a new class Roman II medical device according to ISO 14971. The residual risks identified have been documented, and the team is now determining their acceptability. Considering the regulatory framework for medical devices, which of the following best describes the required approach for justifying the acceptability of residual risks? Option A. The residual risks are acceptable if the device meets all specified performance requirements and has passed all necessary functional tests, implying that any remaining risks are inherent to the technology and therefore unavoidable. Option B. The residual risks are acceptable if the manufacturer can demonstrate that the residual risks are no greater than those typically associated with the use of similar, established medical devices on the market, supported by objective evidence. Option C. The residual risks are acceptable if the risk management team subjectively believes that the remaining risks are minimal and do not pose an undue threat to patients or users. Option D. The residual risks are deemed acceptable if the overall risk reduction achieved during the design process is significant, as evidenced by a reduction in the number of identified hazards compared to the initial design concept. The correct answer is D. The residual risks are deemed acceptable if the overall risk reduction achieved during the design process is significant, as evidenced by a reduction in the number of identified hazards compared to the initial design concept. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows a critical juncture in medical device risk management, where the interpretation and application of regulatory requirements directly impact patient safety and market access. The professional challenge lies in discerning the most appropriate method for assessing residual risk in the context of ISO 14971, while strictly adhering to the specified regulatory framework for medical devices. This requires a nuanced understanding of how general risk management principles translate into specific regulatory expectations, particularly concerning the acceptability of residual risk. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly aligns with the core tenets of ISO 14971 and the overarching regulatory intent of ensuring that the benefits of a medical device outweigh its risks. This approach prioritizes a systematic, documented, and evidence-based justification for residual risk acceptability, which is a fundamental requirement for regulatory compliance and patient safety. It demonstrates a commitment to a robust risk management process that is defensible to regulatory authorities. Incorrect approaches fail by either oversimplifying the assessment, neglecting crucial regulatory nuances, or misinterpreting the scope of ISO 14971 in relation to specific jurisdictional requirements. One incorrect approach might rely solely on historical data without considering the specific intended use or potential failure modes of the device in question, leading to an inadequate assessment of residual risk. Another might incorrectly assume that compliance with ISO 14971 automatically satisfies all regulatory requirements for residual risk acceptability without further specific justification. A third incorrect approach could involve a subjective determination of acceptability without a clear, documented rationale, which is a significant regulatory and ethical failure, as it lacks transparency and auditability. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a structured approach. First, thoroughly understanding the specific regulatory framework applicable to the medical device in the target market. Second, meticulously applying the principles of ISO 14971, ensuring that each step of the risk management process is documented. Third, critically evaluating the residual risks against established criteria for acceptability, which are often defined or influenced by the regulatory framework. Finally, maintaining a clear, objective, and documented rationale for all risk management decisions, particularly concerning the acceptability of residual risk, to ensure compliance and patient safety. Question 3. Governance review demonstrates that the development team for a novel, complex medical device is considering hazard identification techniques. Given the device's unique functionality and potential for unforeseen failure modes, which of the following approaches would best satisfy the comprehensive risk management requirements of ISO 14971 for this specific scenario? Option A. Utilizing a standard hazard and operability (HAZOP) study without specific adaptation to the medical device's unique design and intended use. Option B. Conducting a basic brainstorming session with the development team to list potential hazards based on general knowledge of medical devices. Option C. Relying solely on a pre-existing checklist of common medical device hazards, assuming it will cover all potential issues. Option D. Employing a failure modes and effects analysis (FME) to systematically identify potential failure modes of device components and functions, their causes, and their effects. The correct answer is D. Employing a failure modes and effects analysis (FME) to systematically identify potential failure modes of device components and functions, their causes, and their effects. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in medical device risk management, selecting the most appropriate hazard identification technique when faced with a complex, novel device. The challenge lies in ensuring that the chosen technique is robust enough to uncover potential hazards that might not be immediately obvious, while also being practical and efficient for the development team. The novelty of the device introduces a higher degree of uncertainty, making thorough hazard identification paramount to patient safety and regulatory compliance. A failure to adequately identify hazards can lead to unforeseen risks, product recalls, and significant harm to patients, all of which have severe ethical and legal ramifications. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves selecting a technique that is systematic, comprehensive, and adaptable to the specific characteristics of the novel medical device. For a device with novel functionality and potential for complex failure modes, a failure modes and effects analysis (FME) is often the most suitable technique. FME systematically examines potential failure modes of a device's components and functions, their causes, and their effects. This structured approach allows for the identification of hazards that might arise from design flaws, manufacturing defects, or operational errors. Its strength lies in its proactive nature, enabling the identification of risks early in the design process, which aligns with the principles of ISO 14971 for risk management throughout the product lifecycle. FME detailed breakdown of potential failures and their consequences provides a solid foundation for subsequent risk evaluation and control measures, ensuring that the risk management process is thorough and well documented, as required by regulatory frameworks. Incorrect approaches analysis. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on a less structured or less comprehensive technique, such as a simple brainstorming session or a checklist-based hazard identification, without specific adaptation to the novel device. A brainstorming session, while useful for initial idea generation, may lack the systematic rigor required to uncover all potential failure modes, especially those related to complex interactions within a novel system. It can be prone to biases and may overlook critical hazards if not guided by a structured methodology. Ethically, this approach fails to demonstrate due diligence in protecting patient safety. From a regulatory perspective, it would likely be deemed insufficient evidence of a robust risk management process under ISO 14971, as it does not provide a traceable and systematic record of hazard identification. Another incorrect approach would be to use a technique that is overly simplistic or not designed for the specific context of medical device development, such as a basic hazard and operability (HAZOP) study without significant adaptation. While HAZOP is a powerful technique for process industries, its typical application focuses on deviations from design intent in established processes. Applying it directly to a novel medical device, without tailoring its guide words and methodology to the specific device functions and potential failure modes, could lead to a superficial analysis. This could miss critical hazards unique to the medical device's intended use and potential interactions with patients or healthcare professionals. Ethically, This represents a failure to apply the most appropriate tools for ensuring safety. Regulatory bodies would likely question the adequacy of such an approach in meeting the comprehensive risk management requirements of ISO 14971. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach hazard identification by first understanding the device's intended use, its complexity, and its novelty. They should then evaluate available risk management techniques against these characteristics. The decision-making process should prioritize techniques that offer systematic, comprehensive, and documented identification of potential hazards. This involves considering the technique's ability to uncover both known and unknown risks, its suitability for the device's technology, and its alignment with regulatory expectations, such as those outlined in ISO 14971. When dealing with novel devices, a more in-depth and systematic approach like FME is generally preferred over less structured or less adaptable methods. Professionals must be able to justify their choice of technique based on its effectiveness in achieving thorough hazard identification and its contribution to overall patient safety. Question 4. Implementation of a robust post-market surveillance system for a novel cardiovascular implantable device has identified an increase in reported instances of device malfunction leading to patient hospitalization. The manufacturer's initial response has been to issue a field corrective action notice to healthcare providers, focusing on enhanced user training protocols. However, a deeper analysis of the incident reports reveals a pattern suggesting potential material degradation under specific physiological conditions, which was not fully anticipated during the initial risk assessment. Considering the principles of ISO 14971, which of the following approaches best represents the manufacturer's obligation in analyzing these adverse events and incidents? Option A. Classify the incidents as isolated events stemming from individual patient physiological variations and conclude that no further action is required beyond the existing user training enhancements. Option B. Focus solely on reinforcing user training to mitigate the reported malfunctions, as the primary concern is user handling and interpretation of device performance data. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive root cause analysis to determine if the observed material degradation impacts the device's risk profile, update the risk management file accordingly, and implement CAPA that addresses the root cause, potentially including design modifications or material changes. Option D. Prioritize the development of new device features to address user feedback, deferring a detailed investigation into the material degradation until after the next product iteration is launched. The correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive root cause analysis to determine if the observed material degradation impacts the device's risk profile, update the risk management file accordingly, and implement CAPA that addresses the root cause, potentially including design modifications or material changes. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common yet critical challenge in medical device risk management, effectively analyzing adverse events and incidents to ensure patient safety and regulatory compliance. The challenge lies in moving beyond mere data collection to a robust, systematic investigation that identifies root causes, assesses the severity and likelihood of harm, and drives appropriate corrective and preventive actions. CAPA. The pressure to act quickly while maintaining thoroughness, and the potential for significant patient impact and regulatory scrutiny demand careful judgment. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic, multifaceted analysis of adverse events and incidents that directly aligns with the principles of ISO 13485, Quality Management Systems for Medical Devices, and ISO 14971, Medical Devices Application of Risk Management to Medical Devices. This approach prioritizes understanding the event's context, forming a thorough root cause analysis (RCA) to identify underlying systemic issues rather than just superficial symptoms, and then re-evaluating the risk assessment based on the new information. This iterative process ensures that the risk management file is updated to reflect the actual performance of the device in the field, leading to effective CAPA implementation. This is best professional practice because it directly addresses the core mandate of risk management, to proactively identify and mitigate risks to patients and users. It upholds the ethical responsibility to patient safety and the regulatory obligation to maintain device safety throughout its life cycle. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach focuses solely on immediate corrective actions without a deep dive into the root cause. This is professionally unacceptable because it fails to address the systemic issues that led to the adverse event. It is a superficial fix that is likely to result in recurrence of the problem, potentially leading to further patient harm and noncompliance with regulatory requirements for effective COPPA. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of commitment to preventing future harm. Another incorrect approach involves dismissing the adverse event as an isolated user error without sufficient investigation. This is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. ISO 14971 requires a thorough assessment of all reported incidents, and attributing an event solely to user error without robust evidence can lead to underestimation of device risks and failure to implement necessary design changes or user training improvements. This approach can result in continued risk to patients and noncompliance with post-market surveillance requirements. A third incorrect approach is to delay the analysis and COPPA implementation due to resource constraints. While resource management is important, patient safety and regulatory compliance are paramount. Unnecessary delays in analyzing adverse events and implementing COPPA can lead to ongoing risks, potential for serious patient harm, and significant regulatory penalties for non-compliance with reporting and corrective action timelines. This demonstrates a failure in prioritizing patient well-being and adherence to regulatory mandates. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the regulatory requirements, ISO 13485, ISO 14971, and the organization's quality management system. Upon receiving an adverse event report, the immediate step should be to triage the event based on severity and potential for harm. A systematic investigation process, including a thorough root cause analysis, should then be initiated. This analysis should inform a re-evaluation of the risk management file, leading to the development and implementation of appropriate COPPA. The effectiveness of these COPPA should be verified, and the entire process documented meticulously. This iterative cycle of monitoring, analysis, and improvement is fundamental to maintaining medical device safety and regulatory compliance. Question 5. Market research demonstrates a strong demand for a new, advanced diagnostic feature in an existing medical imaging device. The development team proposes a novel algorithm that, while promising significant diagnostic improvements, introduces a theoretical risk of misinterpretation by the user due to subtle visual artifacts. The team believes the probability of such misinterpretation is extremely low, and the potential benefits of the feature outweigh this minimal risk. They suggest proceeding with the feature's release and monitoring user feedback post-market to address any issues, which approach best aligns with the principles of ISO 971 Medical Devices Risk Management Assessment. Option A. Focus on marketing the benefits of the new diagnostic feature, downplaying the theoretical risk of visual artifacts and assuming users will adapt to any subtle anomalies. Option B. Implement rigorous testing and validation protocols to verify the effectiveness of proposed risk control measures designed to mitigate the visual artifact issue, and document the residual risk assessment before market release. Option C. Release the new feature immediately to capitalize on market demand, relying on post-market surveillance to identify and address any user misinterpretations related to the visual artifacts. Option D. Prioritize the development of additional features to further enhance the device's capabilities, deferring a comprehensive assessment of the visual artifact risk until a later product iteration. The correct answer is B. Implement rigorous testing and validation protocols to verify the effectiveness of proposed risk control measures designed to mitigate the visual artifact issue, and document the residual risk assessment before market release. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate need for a new medical device feature with the fundamental requirement of ensuring patient safety through robust risk control. The pressure to innovate and meet market demand can sometimes lead to overlooking or downplaying potential risks. Careful judgment is required to ensure that risk control measures are not merely a formality, but are genuinely effective in mitigating identified hazards. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the systematic identification, evaluation, and reduction of risks associated with the new feature, aligning directly with the principles of ISO 971. This involves a thorough risk analysis to understand the potential harms, followed by the implementation of appropriate risk control measures that are verified for their effectiveness. The iterative nature of risk management, as mandated by ISO 971, ensures that the residual risk is acceptable before the device is released to the market. This proactive and documented approach demonstrates due diligence and a commitment to patient safety, which is the cornerstone of medical device regulation. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the perceived low probability of harm without adequate verification of control measures is professionally unacceptable. This failure constitutes a regulatory and ethical lapse because it bypasses the systematic risk assessment process required by ISO 971. The standard mandates not just the identification of risks, but also the implementation and verification of controls to reduce them to an acceptable level. Relying on assumptions about low probability without objective evidence of control effectiveness can lead to unforeseen adverse events, violating the ethical duty to protect patients and potentially leading to non-compliance with regulatory requirements. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes speed to market over comprehensive risk control is also professionally unacceptable. This approach demonstrates a disregard for the fundamental principles of medical device risk management. ISO 971 emphasizes that risk management is an integral part of the entire product lifecycle, not an obstacle to be rushed. Cutting corners on risk control measures, even with the intention of addressing them post-market, is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It exposes patients to unnecessary risks and undermines the integrity of the regulatory process. Post-market surveillance is a supplementary measure, not a substitute for pre-market risk assessment and control. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach guided by ISO 971. First, clearly define the scope of the risk assessment for the new feature. Second, systematically identify all potential hazards and hazardous situations. Third, evaluate the risks associated with these hazards, considering both severity and probability. Fourth, implement appropriate risk control measures, prioritizing elimination or reduction of hazards. Fifth, verify the effectiveness of these control measures through testing and validation. Finally, review the residual risk to ensure it is acceptable and document the entire process thoroughly. This systematic, evidence-based approach ensures that innovation does not compromise patient safety. Question 6. The audit findings indicate a potential hazard related to the user interface of a medical device that was not explicitly documented in the initial risk management file. The auditor has raised concerns about the possibility of user error leading to an unintended therapy delivery. What is the most appropriate immediate action to take regarding this finding? Option A. Initiate a formal hazard identification process for the user interface, thoroughly documenting potential causes, effects, and user scenarios, and then proceed with risk analysis and evaluation as per ISO 971. Option B. Immediately instruct the engineering team to redesign the user interface to eliminate the perceived risk without formal hazard identification or risk assessment. Option C. Conduct a brief discussion with the auditor to clarify their concerns, and then proceed with a superficial hazard identification, focusing only on the specific scenario mentioned by the auditor. Option D. Classify the auditor's observation as a minor nonconformity and close the audit finding without further investigation, assuming the current design is adequate. The correct answer is A. Initiate a formal hazard identification process for the user interface, thoroughly documenting potential causes, effects, and user scenarios, and then proceed with risk analysis and evaluation as per ISO 971. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it involves a conflict between the immediate need to address a critical safety issue identified during an audit and the established risk management process. The auditor's finding, while potentially significant, may not have undergone the full rigor of hazard identification and analysis as defined by ISO 971. The challenge lies in balancing the urgency of a potential safety concern with the systematic, documented approach required for effective risk management, ensuring that decisions are based on thorough evaluation rather than immediate reaction. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves initiating a formal hazard identification process, as mandated by ISO 971. This ensures that the potential hazard is systematically documented, its potential causes and effects are explored, and its risk level is assessed according to the established methodology. This aligns with the principles of ISO 971, which emphasizes a structured and documented approach to risk management. By following the defined process, the organization ensures that all relevant aspects of the hazard are considered, leading to appropriate risk control measures and maintaining the integrity of the risk management system. This approach upholds the regulatory requirement for a robust and traceable risk management process. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to immediately implement a design change based solely on the auditor's observation, without a formal hazard identification. This bypasses the systematic risk assessment process required by ISO 971. The failure here is in not establishing the hazard's existence and potential impact through the defined risk management procedures, potentially leading to an inefficient or ineffective control measure, or overlooking other related hazards. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the auditor's finding as a minor observation without further investigation. This is a failure to acknowledge a potential safety concern and to adhere to the principle of continuous improvement in risk management. ISO 971 requires proactive identification and assessment of risks, and ignoring a finding, even if seemingly minor, can lead to the omission of a significant hazard from the risk management file. A third incorrect approach would be to conduct a superficial hazard identification that does not involve relevant stakeholders or consider all potential use scenarios. This would fail to meet the comprehensive nature of hazard identification as intended by ISO 971, which requires a thorough exploration of potential harms. The risk assessment would then be based on incomplete information, leading to inadequate risk controls. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by recognizing that audit findings are triggers for review, not necessarily immediate solutions. The decision-making process should involve 1. Acknowledging the audit finding and its potential implications. 2. Initiating the defined risk management process for hazard identification, ensuring it is thorough and documented. 3. Engaging relevant cross-functional teams, e.g., R&D, quality, clinical in the hazard identification and analysis. 4. Evaluating the identified hazard and its associated risks against the established risk acceptability criteria. 5. Implementing appropriate risk control measures based on the risk assessment and verifying their effectiveness. 6. Updating the risk management file accordingly. This systematic approach ensures compliance with ISO 971 and promotes robust patient safety. Question 7. Strategic planning requires a thorough and systematic approach to risk evaluation for medical devices. Considering the principles of ISO 971, which of the following best describes the process for determining the acceptability of residual risks associated with a new diagnostic imaging device that offers significant diagnostic improvements, but also presents a potential for radiation exposure? Option A. The residual risks are deemed acceptable if the device has received positive feedback from a few key opinion leaders in the field, and the manufacturer believes the benefits outweigh the risks. Option B. The residual risks are deemed acceptable if the device is intended for use by highly trained professionals who are assumed to be aware of and able to manage the radiation risks. Option C. The residual risks are deemed acceptable after a comprehensive evaluation against predefined risk acceptability criteria, considering the severity of potential harm from radiation exposure and its probability, and documenting the justification for acceptability. Option D. The residual risks are deemed acceptable if the potential clinical benefits are substantial, and the probability of harm from radiation exposure is considered low by the development team. Correct answer is D. The residual risks are deemed acceptable if the potential clinical benefits are substantial, and the probability of harm from radiation exposure is considered low by the development team. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the perceived benefits of a medical device with the potential risks to various stakeholders, including patients, healthcare professionals, and the manufacturer. The challenge lies in objectively evaluating risk in the context of differing perspectives and priorities, particularly when a device offers significant clinical advantages but carries a non-negligible risk profile. ISO 971 mandates a systematic approach to risk management, emphasizing that risk evaluation is not merely a technical exercise, but a crucial step in ensuring the overall safety and effectiveness of the medical device throughout its life cycle. The inherent subjectivity in assessing the acceptability of risk, influenced by stakeholder expectations and the availability of alternatives, necessitates a robust and well-documented process. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it aligns directly with the principles and requirements of ISO 971 for medical device risk management. It emphasizes a comprehensive evaluation of identified risks against established risk acceptability criteria, considering the intended use, foreseeable misuse, and the characteristics of the target population. This approach necessitates a systematic review of the severity of potential harm and the probability of its occurrence, leading to a reasoned determination of whether the residual risk is acceptable. This aligns with the ethical imperative to protect patient safety and the regulatory requirement to demonstrate that the benefits of the medical device outweigh its risks. The process involves documented evidence and justification for the risk acceptability decision, which is crucial for regulatory submissions and post-market surveillance. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that prioritizes the immediate clinical benefits without a thorough, documented evaluation of the associated risks fails to meet the requirements of ISO 971. This is a regulatory failure as it bypasses the systematic risk assessment process mandated by the standard. Ethically, it is unacceptable as it potentially exposes patients and users to harm without adequate consideration or mitigation. An approach that dismisses risks solely because they are rare, even if the severity of harm is high, is also a regulatory and ethical failure. ISO 971 requires consideration of both probability and severity. Ignoring high-severity risks, regardless of their perceived low probability, can lead to catastrophic outcomes and violates the principle of due diligence in risk management. An approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or the opinions of a limited group of stakeholders without a structured, objective risk evaluation process is professionally unsound. This is a regulatory failure because it lacks the systematic, documented evidence required by ISO 971. Ethically, it is flawed as it may not adequately represent the full spectrum of potential risks or the diverse needs and concerns of all relevant stakeholders. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic, evidence-based approach to risk evaluation as outlined in ISO 971. This involves clearly defining risk acceptability criteria, systematically assessing identified risks against these criteria, and documenting the rationale for all decisions. When faced with complex risk-benefit trade-offs, professionals should engage in a multidisciplinary review, considering input from all relevant stakeholders, and ensuring that the final decision is well justified, documented, and defensible. The process should be iterative, with risk evaluation revisited throughout the device lifecycle. Question 8. Consider a scenario where a medical device manufacturer has completed its initial risk management file for a newly launched product. Post-market surveillance data begins to show a small number of adverse event reports related to a specific functional aspect of the device. These reports are infrequent, but the potential severity of the described adverse events is significant. According to ISO 14971, what is the most appropriate course of action for the manufacturer regarding their risk analysis? Option A. Immediately halt all production and initiate a full product redesign to address the potential issue without further investigation. Option B. Dismiss the adverse event reports as statistically insignificant due to their low frequency and continue with the existing risk analysis. Option C. Rely solely on the initial risk assessment, assuming that the infrequent nature of the reports indicates no change in the device's risk profile. Option D. Initiate a comprehensive review of the risk analysis, investigating the root cause of the reported adverse events and assessing their impact on the device's risk profile. The correct answer is D. Initiate a comprehensive review of the risk analysis, investigating the root cause of the reported adverse events and assessing their impact on the device's risk profile. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in medical device risk management. balancing the need for comprehensive risk analysis with the practical constraints of resource allocation and the dynamic nature of post-market surveillance. The challenge lies in determining the appropriate scope and depth of the risk analysis for a device that has undergone initial risk assessment, but is now exhibiting new, albeit infrequent, adverse event reports. The professional difficulty arises from the potential for underreaction, leading to patient harm, or overreaction, leading to unnecessary and costly redesigns or recalls. A nuanced understanding of ISO 14971 requirements for risk analysis, particularly concerning the evaluation of new information, is critical. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic re-evaluation of the risk analysis based on the new adverse event data. This aligns directly with the principles of ISO 14971, which mandates that risk management is a continuous process throughout the entire life cycle of a medical device. Specifically, the standard requires manufacturers to review and update risk management activities when new information becomes available, such as post-market surveillance data indicating potential new hazards or increased severity/probability of known hazards. A thorough review would involve investigating the root cause of the reported adverse events, assessing whether these events were previously identified and their risks adequately controlled, and determining if the probability of occurrence or severity of harm has changed. If the new information indicates that the residual risk is no longer acceptable or that previously unidentified risks exist, the risk management plan must be updated and appropriate risk control measures implemented. This iterative process ensures that the device's risk profile remains acceptable in light of real-world performance. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to dismiss the adverse event reports solely because they are infrequent. This fails to acknowledge that even rare events can have severe consequences, and ISO 14971 does not set a threshold for the frequency of adverse events that warrants investigation. Ethical and regulatory failures include neglecting the potential for cumulative harm and failing to uphold the duty of care to patients. Another incorrect approach is to immediately initiate a full redesign without a proper investigation. This represents an overreaction that is not supported by a systematic risk analysis. It can lead to unnecessary costs, delays in product availability, and potentially introduce new risks. The regulatory failure here is the lack of a data-driven, risk-based decision-making process as required by ISO 14971. A third incorrect approach is to rely solely on the initial risk assessment without considering the new post-market data. This is a direct violation of the continuous risk management requirement and ignores the fundamental principle that risk management is an ongoing process, not a one-time activity. The ethical failure is a disregard for patient safety, and the regulatory failure is a clear breach of the standard's mandate for ongoing risk evaluation. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured, data-driven approach. First, acknowledge and document all reported adverse events. Second, initiate a thorough investigation into the reported events to determine their root cause and potential contributing factors. Third, compare the findings of the investigation with the existing risk analysis and risk management file. Fourth, if the new information suggests a change in the risk profile, e.g., increased probability, increased severity, or new hazards, update the risk analysis accordingly. Fifth, reevaluate the acceptability of the residual risk and implement additional risk control measures if necessary. This systematic process ensures compliance with ISO 14971 and upholds the ethical obligation to protect patient safety. Question 9. What factors determine the appropriate selection of terminology for hazard identification and risk analysis within a medical device risk management assessment conducted according to ISO 971? Option A. Definitions derived from other quality management system standards not directly related to medical device risk management. Option B. General industry best practices for risk management, irrespective of specific medical device regulations. Option C. Common language interpretations of terms used in everyday technical documentation. Option D. The precise definitions and specific terminology as explicitly stated and defined within the ISO 971 standard itself. The correct answer is D. The precise definitions and specific terminology as explicitly stated and defined within the ISO 971 standard itself. Explanation. The The scenario presents a challenge in accurately applying definitions and terminology within the ISO 971 framework for medical device risk management. Professionals must navigate potential ambiguities and ensure consistent interpretation across different stages of the risk management process. The challenge lies in selecting the most precise and contextually appropriate terminology as defined by the standard, which directly impacts the validity and effectiveness of the risk assessment. The correct approach is to rely on the explicit definitions provided within ISO 971 itself. This ensures adherence to the established terminology, promoting clarity, consistency, and comparability of risk management activities. Using the standard's definitions is best professional practice because it aligns directly with the regulatory intent of ISO 971, which is to provide a harmonized and robust framework for medical device risk management. This adherence is ethically sound as it prioritizes patient safety by ensuring that risk assessments are conducted based on a shared and understood vocabulary. An incorrect approach would be to use definitions from other, unrelated standards or general industry glossaries. This fails to comply with the specific jurisdictional requirements of ISO 971, potentially introducing terms or concepts that are not recognized or intended within the medical device risk management context. This can lead to misinterpretation of risks, inadequate mitigation strategies, and ultimately, compromise patient safety, representing a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Another incorrect approach is to infer definitions based on common language usage, which can be subjective and deviate from the precise technical meanings intended by the standard. This lack of rigor can result in inconsistent application of risk management principles and a failure to meet the explicit requirements of ISO 971, leading to regulatory noncompliance and ethical concerns regarding due diligence. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that prioritizes consulting the ISO 971 standard for all definitions and terminology. When faced with potential ambiguity, they should seek clarification from authoritative sources related to the standard or engage in internal consensus building based on the standard's principles. This systematic approach ensures that all risk management activities are grounded in the correct, contextually relevant definitions, thereby upholding regulatory compliance and ethical obligations to patient safety. Question 10. When evaluating the impact of a minor software update that introduces a new user interface element to an existing medical device, what is the most appropriate risk management process step to undertake according to ISO 14971? Option A. Conduct a targeted risk assessment specifically for the new user interface element, analyzing its potential hazards and evaluating any resulting changes to the overall risk profile of the device, documenting the findings and any necessary risk control measures. Option B. Initiate a complete revalidation of the entire risk management file for the medical device, as any software change requires a full system-wide risk reassessment. Option C. Assume that minor software updates do not introduce new risks and proceed without any risk management review for this specific change. Option D. Perform a cursory review of the user interface element without detailed hazard identification or risk evaluation, relying on the assumption that the change is insignificant. The correct answer is A. Conduct a targeted risk assessment specifically for the new user interface element, analyzing its potential hazards and evaluating any resulting changes to the overall risk profile of the device, documenting the findings and any necessary risk control measures. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in medical device risk management, balancing the need for comprehensive risk assessment with the practical constraints of resource allocation and time. The introduction of a new feature, even if seemingly minor, necessitates a thorough reevaluation of the risk management process to ensure patient safety and regulatory compliance. The challenge lies in determining the appropriate depth and scope of this reevaluation without causing undue delays or unnecessary expenditure, while still adhering to the principles of ISO 14971. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic review of the existing risk management file, specifically focusing on how the new feature impacts previously identified risks and whether new risks have been introduced. This aligns directly with the iterative nature of risk management as described in ISO 14971. It requires a documented assessment of the new feature's potential hazards, the estimation of associated risks, and the evaluation of whether these risks are acceptable. If risks are not acceptable, appropriate risk control measures must be identified, implemented, and verified. This approach ensures that the risk management process remains current and effective throughout the device's lifecycle, fulfilling the regulatory requirement to maintain an up-to-date risk management file. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to assume that because the feature is minor, no significant impact on risk is possible, and therefore no reevaluation is needed. This violates the fundamental principle of ISO 14971 that requires a review of risks whenever changes are made to the device or its intended use. It represents a failure to proactively identify and mitigate potential hazards, leading to a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Another incorrect approach would be to conduct a superficial review without proper documentation or a systematic hazard identification process for the new feature. This would not provide sufficient evidence of due diligence and could lead to the overlooking of critical risks. Ethically, this is unacceptable as it prioritizes expediency over patient safety. From a regulatory standpoint, it fails to meet the requirements for a robust and documented risk management process. A third incorrect approach might be to over-engineer the review process, conducting a full revalidation of the entire device's risk management file for a minor feature. While thoroughness is important, this approach is inefficient and can lead to significant delays and resource misallocation, potentially hindering the timely delivery of beneficial medical technology. While not a direct safety failure, it represents a failure in the efficient application of the risk management process as intended by ISO 14971. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the scope of the change. A documented change control process should trigger a risk management review. The review should be proportionate to the change, focusing on the specific areas of the risk management file that could be affected. This involves asking, what are the potential hazards introduced by this new feature? How might it interact with existing functionalities? What are the potential harms to patients or users? The output of this review must be documented, including the rationale for decisions made and any identified new risks or changes to existing risks, along with the implemented or planned risk control measures. This systematic and documented approach ensures compliance and upholds the ethical responsibility to patient safety. Question 11. The performance metrics show that the new implantable cardiac defibrillator, ICD, meets all specified electrical and mechanical parameters in laboratory testing. However, during initial clinical trials, a small but statistically significant number of patients reported discomfort and anxiety related to the device's vibration feedback during charging. The risk management team is debating the next steps, which approach best addresses the potential risks associated with this feedback mechanism. Option A. Engage a panel of electrophysiologists and cardiac nurses to assess the clinical significance of the reported discomfort and anxiety, and to explore potential mitigation strategies for user and patient experience. Option B. Conduct further laboratory testing to refine the vibration parameters and reevaluate the performance metrics. Option C. Rely on the existing performance metrics as the device is functioning as designed, and document the reported discomfort as an acceptable user experience variation. Option D. Immediately redesign the vibration feedback system to eliminate it entirely based on the reported discomfort. The correct answer is B. Conduct further laboratory testing to refine the vibration parameters and reevaluate the performance metrics. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in medical device risk management, ensuring that the risk assessment accurately reflects real-world use and potential hazards that may not be immediately apparent from technical data alone. The performance metrics, while objective, only tell part of the story. The true effectiveness and safety of a medical device are ultimately determined by how it is used by clinicians and patients in diverse clinical settings. The professional challenge lies in bridging the gap between engineering specifications and clinical reality. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the integration of diverse perspectives, particularly those of end users and clinical experts, into the risk management process. ISO 971 emphasizes the need for input from individuals with knowledge of the device's intended use, potential misuse, and the clinical environment. Clinical experts and users can identify hazards related to usability, workflow integration, patient factors, and unforeseen clinical scenarios that may not be captured by purely technical performance data. Their involvement ensures that the risk assessment is comprehensive, practical, and leads to effective risk control measures that enhance patient safety and device efficacy in actual use. This aligns with the ethical imperative to protect patient well-being and the regulatory requirement for robust risk management. An incorrect approach that relies solely on the technical performance metrics fails to acknowledge the critical role of human factors and clinical context in medical device safety. This approach risks overlooking significant hazards, such as those arising from user error due to poor design, inadequate training, or unexpected patient conditions. Ethically, this is a failure to exercise due diligence in protecting patients. From a regulatory standpoint, it violates the principles of comprehensive risk assessment as mandated by ISO 971, which requires consideration of all foreseeable use and misuse. Another incorrect approach that involves consulting only a limited group of internal engineers, despite their technical expertise, also falls short. While engineers understand the device's design and performance, they may lack the direct clinical experience necessary to anticipate all potential real-world hazards. This can lead to a biased risk assessment that is overly focused on design flaws and less on the complexities of clinical application. This approach is professionally deficient because it limits the scope of input, potentially missing crucial insights from those who interact with the device in its intended environment. A further incorrect approach that dismisses the need for user feedback because the device has undergone extensive laboratory testing overlooks the inherent limitations of simulated environments. Laboratory testing cannot fully replicate the variability of clinical settings, patient populations, and the dynamic nature of healthcare. Relying solely on such testing without real-world user input is a significant regulatory and ethical failing, as it does not adequately address the risks associated with actual use. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach to gathering input from all relevant stakeholders. This includes not only technical experts, but also clinicians, nurses, patients, where appropriate, and other end users. The process should involve actively seeking out potential hazards and risks through methods such as usability studies, post-market surveillance, and direct observation of the device in use. The insights gained from these diverse sources should then be systematically integrated into the risk management file, informing the identification, evaluation, and control of risks. Question 12. Cost-benefit analysis shows that implementing a minor design modification to address a potential, albeit infrequent, user error that could lead to a suboptimal clinical outcome would incur significant upfront costs and delay market entry. However, the analysis also indicates that not implementing the modification would likely result in a small but consistent number of adverse event reports over the product's lifecycle, which would necessitate future regulatory reporting and potential corrective actions. Given this, what is the most appropriate course of action from a regulatory compliance and risk management perspective? Option A. Defer the design modification, relying on user training and labeling to mitigate the risk, and only report adverse events if they reach a predefined threshold to avoid immediate regulatory scrutiny. Option B. Proceed with the design modification and report the potential risk to regulatory authorities as part of the ongoing risk management process, even if it impacts immediate cost and timeline. Option C. Focus solely on the initial cost-benefit analysis that favors delaying the modification, and assume that user training will be sufficient to prevent any significant adverse events. Option D. Implement the design modification only if the cost-benefit analysis strongly favors it after a prolonged period of market observation, and only report if the number of adverse events becomes substantial. The correct answer is B. Proceed with the design modification and report the potential risk to regulatory authorities as part of the ongoing risk management process, even if it impacts immediate cost and timeline. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it forces a decision between immediate financial savings and long-term regulatory compliance and patient safety, which are paramount in medical device risk management. The pressure to reduce costs can create a conflict of interest, requiring careful judgment to prioritize ethical and legal obligations over economic expediency. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the reporting of a potential safety issue as mandated by regulatory frameworks. ISO 971 in conjunction with relevant national medical device regulations, e.g., UK's MHRA guidance for medical devices, emphasizes a proactive and transparent approach to risk management. This includes the obligation to report adverse events and potential hazards to regulatory authorities. Delaying or omitting such reporting, even if the immediate cost-benefit analysis suggests otherwise, violates the fundamental principles of patient safety and regulatory integrity. It also undermines the trust placed in the manufacturer by both regulators and users. An incorrect approach that prioritizes cost savings over reporting would be a significant regulatory failure. It demonstrates a disregard for the legal and ethical obligations to inform authorities about potential risks, which could lead to serious patient harm. Such an approach could result in severe penalties, including fines, product recalls, and reputational damage. Ethically, it represents a breach of the duty of care owed to patients and a failure to uphold professional standards. Another incorrect approach might involve attempting to downplay the significance of the issue internally without proper investigation or external reporting. This is a failure to conduct a thorough risk assessment as required by ISO 971. The standard mandates a systematic process for identifying, analyzing, evaluating, and controlling risks. Circumventing this process to avoid reporting is a direct violation of the standard's intent and regulatory requirements. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the applicable regulatory framework, including reporting thresholds and timelines. Professionals must be trained to identify potential reportable events and understand their obligations. When faced with such a dilemma, the process should be: 1. Identify the potential risk and its severity. 2. Consult the relevant regulatory requirements and internal procedures for reporting. 3. Conduct a thorough risk assessment, even if it contradicts initial cost-benefit projections. 4. Report the issue to the appropriate regulatory authorities within the stipulated timeframe, regardless of the immediate financial implications. 5. Document all decisions and actions taken. Question 13. Compliance review shows that for a newly developed infusion pump, the risk management file documents several control measures intended to prevent incorrect dosage delivery. However, the verification and validation activities described for these measures are limited to internal design reviews and a statement that the features are user-friendly. What is the most appropriate next step to ensure compliance with ISO 14971 regarding the implementation of risk control measures? Option A. Update the risk management file to include a more detailed description of the intended function of each control measure. Option B. Seek feedback from a small group of experienced clinicians to confirm their perception of the control measure's effectiveness. Option C. Conduct objective verification and validation activities to demonstrate that the implemented risk control measures effectively reduce the risk of incorrect dosage delivery to an acceptable level. Option D. Rely on post-market surveillance data to assess the effectiveness of the implemented risk control measures. Correct answer is C. Conduct objective verification and validation activities to demonstrate that the implemented risk control measures effectively reduce the risk of incorrect dosage delivery to an acceptable level. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in medical device risk management: the effective implementation of risk control measures after initial identification. The challenge lies in ensuring that the implemented measures are not only technically sound, but also demonstrably effective in reducing risk to an acceptable level, as required by ISO 14971. The professional difficulty arises from the need to move beyond mere documentation of control measures to a robust verification and validation process that provides objective evidence of their efficacy. This requires a deep understanding of the device's intended use, potential hazards, and the specific mechanisms by which the control measures are expected to mitigate risk. Furthermore, the iterative nature of risk management means that the effectiveness of implemented controls must be continuously monitored and reassessed, especially in light of new information or changes in the device or its use environment. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic process of verifying that the implemented risk control measures are correctly installed and function as intended, followed by validation to confirm that these measures effectively reduce the identified risks to an acceptable level. This aligns directly with the principles of ISO 14971, which mandates that risk control measures be verified and validated. Verification ensures that the design and implementation of the control measure meet the specified requirements. Validation, on the other hand, confirms that the risk control measure achieves the intended risk reduction in the context of the actual or simulated use of the medical device. This approach provides objective evidence, which is crucial for demonstrating compliance and ensuring patient safety. It moves beyond simply stating that a control exists to proving that it works and achieves the desired outcome, thereby fulfilling the ethical and regulatory obligation to manage risks effectively. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that the mere documentation of a risk control measure in the risk management file is sufficient evidence of its effectiveness. This fails to meet the verification and validation requirements of ISO 14971. It represents a significant regulatory failure, as it bypasses the critical step of proving that the control actually reduces risk. Ethically, this is unacceptable as it prioritizes administrative completion over patient safety. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on subjective assessments or anecdotal evidence from users regarding the effectiveness of a control measure. While user feedback is valuable, it does not constitute objective evidence required for validation. This approach is professionally weak because it lacks the rigor demanded by the standard and could lead to a false sense of security regarding risk reduction. It is a regulatory failure because it does not provide the necessary objective evidence for the risk management file. A third incorrect approach is to implement a control measure and then fail to reevaluate the residual risk. ISO 14971 requires that the residual risk be evaluated after the implementation of risk control measures. If this evaluation is not performed, or if it is performed inadequately, the manufacturer cannot demonstrate that the overall residual risk is acceptable. This is a direct violation of the standard's requirements and a failure to ensure that the device is safe for its intended use. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach the implementation of risk control measures with a mindset of continuous improvement and evidence-based decision-making. The process should begin with a clear understanding of the identified hazard and the intended effect of the control measure. This understanding should then guide the development of specific verification and validation activities. These activities should be planned, executed, and documented meticulously, generating objective evidence. When evaluating the effectiveness of control measures, professionals must ask, have we proven with objective evidence that this measure reduces the risk to an acceptable level? If the answer is not a confident yes, further investigation, refinement, or additional control measures are necessary. This systematic, evidence-driven approach ensures compliance with ISO 14971 and upholds the ethical imperative to protect patient safety. Question 14. The efficiency study reveals a potential for a new hazard to affect the performance of a critical medical device component during prolonged use. Considering the principles of ISO 971, what is the most appropriate immediate action to ensure patient safety and regulatory compliance? Option A. Immediately halt all production and distribution of the device until the hazard can be fully investigated and resolved, regardless of the potential impact on patient access to essential medical treatment. Option B. Conduct a thorough risk assessment to evaluate the newly identified hazard, determine its potential impact on patient safety, and implement appropriate risk control measures as per the risk management plan. Option C. Document the identified hazard in the next scheduled risk management review to ensure it is addressed in future design iterations. Assuming the current risk level is acceptable, Option D. Implement a minor design modification based on initial assumptions about the hazard's severity, without a formal risk assessment or validation, to expedite a solution. The correct answer is B. Conduct a thorough risk assessment to evaluate the newly identified hazard, determine its potential impact on patient safety, and implement appropriate risk control measures as per the risk management plan. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in medical device development where a newly identified potential hazard emerges late in the product lifecycle. The professional challenge lies in balancing the urgency of addressing a safety concern with the practicalities of design changes, regulatory compliance, and market impact. The need for rigorous risk management is paramount, as failure to adequately address a known hazard can lead to patient harm, regulatory sanctions, and reputational damage. Careful judgment is required to determine the most effective and compliant course of action. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach, which involves a comprehensive risk assessment and management process as outlined by ISO 971, represents best professional practice. ISO 971 mandates a systematic approach to identifying, analyzing, evaluating, and controlling risks associated with medical devices throughout their life cycle. When a new hazard is identified, the standard requires re-evaluation of the risk management plan. This includes determining the severity and probability of harm, assessing the acceptability of the risk, and implementing appropriate risk control measures. Documenting this process, including the rationale for decisions, is crucial for regulatory compliance and demonstrating due diligence. This approach ensures that patient safety remains the primary consideration, and that any modifications are implemented in a controlled and validated manner. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to dismiss the identified hazard as minor without a formal risk assessment. This fails to adhere to the systematic risk management principles of ISO 971, which require objective evaluation of all identified hazards. Ethically, it prioritizes expediency over patient safety. Regulatory failure stems from neglecting the requirement to document and manage identified risks. Another incorrect approach would be to implement a quick fix without proper risk assessment or validation. This bypasses the critical steps of risk analysis and evaluation, potentially introducing new, unforeseen risks or failing to adequately mitigate the original one. This is a direct violation of ISO 971 emphasis on a structured and validated approach to risk control. It also poses an ethical risk by potentially exposing patients to unmanaged hazards. A third incorrect approach would be to delay the assessment and implementation of controls until the next scheduled product review. This neglects the immediate need to address a known potential hazard, violating the principle of proactive risk management. ISO 971 emphasizes continuous risk management, meaning identified risks should be addressed promptly, not deferred. This poses a significant ethical and regulatory risk due to the potential for harm during the delay. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by initiating an immediate, formal risk assessment process as per ISO 971. This involves convening the risk management team, thoroughly investigating the nature and potential impact of the newly identified hazard, and documenting all findings and decisions. The decision-making process should be guided by the risk acceptability criteria established in the risk management plan. If the risk is deemed unacceptable, appropriate risk control measures must be identified, implemented, and validated. Throughout this process, clear communication with regulatory bodies and stakeholders is essential. The focus should always be on a systematic, documented, and evidence-based approach to ensure patient safety and regulatory compliance. Question 15. The control framework reveals a significant residual risk associated with a new medical device that, while technically within the defined acceptable risk levels according to ISO 14971, is novel and has not been previously encountered in similar device submissions to the regulatory authority. What is the most appropriate course of action for the manufacturer regarding collaboration with the regulatory body? Option A. Withhold detailed information about the novelty of the risk until specifically requested by the regulatory body during the review. Option B. Downplay the novelty of the risk in the documentation to avoid potential scrutiny and expedite the submission process. Option C. Submit the risk management assessment as is, assuming the regulatory body will identify and address the novel risk during their review process. Option D. Proactively engage with the regulatory body, providing detailed documentation of the novel risk, the mitigation strategies employed, and the rationale for its acceptance, seeking their input and guidance. The correct answer is D. Proactively engage with the regulatory body, providing detailed documentation of the novel risk, the mitigation strategies employed, and the rationale for its acceptance, seeking their input and guidance. Explanation. The control framework reveals a potential discrepancy in the risk management assessment for a novel medical device. The manufacturer has identified a significant residual risk that, while within the acceptable risk criteria defined by ISO 14971, is novel and has not been extensively documented in previous submissions to the regulatory body. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a delicate balance between adhering to established risk acceptance criteria and proactively engaging with the regulatory authority to ensure transparency and prevent potential future issues or delays. The manufacturer must decide how to best communicate this novel risk to the regulator, considering the potential impact on market authorization and post-market surveillance. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes proactive and transparent communication with the regulatory body. Engaging the regulator early, providing comprehensive data, and seeking their input demonstrates a commitment to patient safety and regulatory compliance. This aligns with the spirit of ISO 14971, which emphasizes continuous risk management throughout the product lifecycle. By involving the regulator, the manufacturer mitigates the risk of unexpected objections or requests for additional information later in the process, fostering a collaborative relationship and ensuring a smoother path to market. This approach also allows the regulator to provide valuable feedback based on their broader understanding of device safety trends and previous submissions. An incorrect approach that involves withholding this information until a formal submission would be a significant regulatory and ethical failure, breaches the principle of transparency expected by regulatory bodies, and could be interpreted as an attempt to circumvent scrutiny. This could lead to delays, rejection of the submission, or even post-market actions if the risk is later identified by the regulator or through adverse event reporting. Another incorrect approach, such as downplaying the novelty of the risk in the documentation, is ethically unsound and undermines the integrity of the risk management process. It misrepresents the data and could mislead the regulator, jeopardizing patient safety. Finally, assuming the regulator will automatically accept the risk because it meets defined criteria, without any proactive communication about its novelty, demonstrates a lack of diligence and a failure to anticipate potential regulatory concerns. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of the regulatory requirements and the specific context of the identified risk. When a novel or potentially contentious risk is identified, even if technically within acceptable limits, the professional should assess the potential impact of its novelty on regulatory perception. The next step involves developing a clear and concise communication strategy, including a comprehensive data package that explains the risk, the mitigation measures, and the rationale for its acceptance. This strategy should then be implemented through proactive engagement with the relevant regulatory body, seeking their guidance and feedback. This iterative process of assessment, communication, and feedback is crucial for navigating complex regulatory landscapes and ensuring the successful and safe introduction of medical devices. Question 16. The monitoring system demonstrates a statistically significant improvement in data accuracy following a software update. However, preliminary internal analysis suggests this improvement might inadvertently increase the risk of false alarms for a specific subset of patients with rare physiological conditions, a risk not fully appreciated by the development team. The manufacturer is considering releasing the update without further consultation to expedite the benefits of improved accuracy for the majority of users. Which of the following actions best aligns with the principles of ISO 971 for medical device risk management assessment, particularly concerning stakeholder involvement? Option A. Inform the regulatory body of the potential risk and await their guidance on how to proceed, without directly engaging with patient groups or medical professionals. Option B. Conduct a further internal technical review focusing solely on the software code to identify the root cause of the potential false alarm increase, without involving external parties at this stage. Option C. Proceed with the software update to leverage the immediate accuracy benefits for the majority of users, and address any potential false alarm issues that arise post-market through a future patch. Option D. Immediately engage with patient advocacy groups representing individuals with rare physiological conditions and relevant medical specialists to gather their insights on the potential false alarm risk and its clinical implications before proceeding with the update. The correct answer is D. Immediately engage with patient advocacy groups representing individuals with rare physiological conditions and relevant medical specialists to gather their insights on the potential false alarm risk and its clinical implications before proceeding with the update. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need for product improvement with the ethical obligation to involve all relevant stakeholders, particularly those who may be negatively impacted by the proposed changes. The core of the dilemma lies in the potential for a perceived conflict of interest and the need for transparency and fairness in the risk management process. ISO 971 emphasizes the importance of considering the perspectives of all relevant stakeholders throughout the risk management lifecycle. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a comprehensive and inclusive risk assessment process. By actively seeking input from patient advocacy groups and healthcare professionals, the manufacturer demonstrates a commitment to understanding the real-world impact of the device and its potential risks from the user's and patient's perspectives. This aligns with the ethical principles of beneficence and non-maleficence, ensuring that the device's benefits outweigh its risks for all affected parties. Furthermore, involving these groups fosters trust and transparency, which are crucial for the long-term success and acceptance of medical devices. An incorrect approach that excludes patient advocacy groups fails to acknowledge their legitimate interest and potential expertise in understanding patient experiences and concerns. This exclusion can lead to an incomplete risk assessment, potentially overlooking critical safety issues or usability challenges that directly affect patient well-being. Ethically, it is a failure to uphold the principle of justice by not giving a voice to those most directly impacted. From a regulatory standpoint, it may also be seen as a failure to adequately consider all relevant inputs for risk assessment as mandated by ISO 971. Another incorrect approach that solely relies on internal engineering feedback, while valuable, is insufficient. This approach risks creating an echo chamber where potential biases or blind spots within the development team are not identified. It neglects the crucial external validation that comes from diverse stakeholder perspectives, potentially leading to a product that is technically sound but not practically safe or effective for its intended users and patients. This can result in regulatory noncompliance due to an inadequate risk assessment and a breach of ethical responsibility to ensure patient safety. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach to stakeholder identification and engagement. This includes proactively identifying all relevant stakeholders at the outset of the risk management process, understanding their potential interests and concerns, and establishing clear communication channels. When potential conflicts or sensitive information arise, professionals should adopt a transparent and collaborative approach, seeking to understand differing viewpoints and finding common ground where possible. The focus should always be on ensuring that the risk management process is robust, comprehensive, and ultimately serves to protect patient safety and promote the effective use of medical devices. Question 17. The assessment process reveals that a medical device manufacturer has a comprehensive post-market surveillance system in place, collecting a significant volume of user feedback and complaint data. However, the risk management team has not systematically reviewed this data to update the device's risk management file or implement any new risk control measures in the past 2 years. From a regulatory and ethical perspective, what is the most appropriate course of action for the risk management team? Option A. Immediately initiate a thorough review of all collected post-market surveillance data to identify any emerging hazards or previously unrecognized risks and update the risk management file accordingly, implementing necessary risk control measures. Option B. Archive the collected post-market surveillance data for future reference and focus resources on developing new product lines. Option C. Continue to rely on the initial risk assessment conducted during the pre-market phase, assuming that the existing risk controls are sufficient unless a major safety incident is reported. Option D. Conduct a limited review of only the most severe complaints received in the last 6 months to assess potential risks. The correct answer is A. Immediately initiate a thorough review of all collected post-market surveillance data to identify any emerging hazards or previously unrecognized risks and update the risk management file accordingly, implementing necessary risk control measures. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a common challenge in medical device risk management: the transition from pre-market approval to post-market vigilance. While ISO 13485, 2016, which incorporates ISO 14971, 2019 Principles for Risk Management mandates robust risk management throughout the product lifecycle. The effectiveness of post-market surveillance, PMS, is crucial for identifying and mitigating newly discovered risks. The challenge lies in ensuring that PMS data is systematically collected, analyzed, and acted upon to update risk assessments and implement necessary corrective actions, thereby protecting patient safety and maintaining regulatory compliance. The correct approach emphasizes the proactive and iterative nature of risk management, recognizing that PMS is not merely a data collection exercise, but an integral part of the ongoing risk assessment and control process. By actively seeking and analyzing PMS data, manufacturers can identify emerging hazards, assess their impact, and implement appropriate risk control measures, which may include design changes, updated labeling, or even product recalls. This aligns with the fundamental principles of ISO 14971-2019, which requires a continuous process of risk management throughout the device's life. Ethically, this approach prioritizes patient safety by addressing potential harms that may not have been apparent during pre-market testing. An incorrect approach that neglects to integrate PMS data into the risk management process represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Such an approach would violate the spirit and letter of ISO 13485, 2016, and ISO 14971, 2019, by failing to maintain an up-to-date risk management file, and by not taking appropriate action to mitigate identified risks. This could lead to continued exposure of patients to potential harm, resulting in adverse events, regulatory noncompliance, and damage to the manufacturer's reputation. Another incorrect approach might involve a superficial review of PMS data, failing to conduct a thorough risk assessment of any identified issues. This would also be a regulatory failure, as it demonstrates a lack of due diligence in managing device risks. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes the continuous improvement of risk management. This involves establishing clear procedures for PMS data collection and analysis, ensuring that this data is fed back into the risk management process, and empowering the risk management team to make timely decisions regarding risk control measures. Regular reviews of the risk management file, incorporating PMS findings, are essential. This proactive and integrated approach ensures that the manufacturer remains compliant with regulatory requirements. More importantly, upholds its ethical obligation to patient safety. Question 18. Cost-benefit analysis shows that a proposed software update for a medical device could significantly reduce the probability of a known hazard, but it incurs a substantial development and validation cost. The current risk control for this hazard is considered acceptable by the manufacturer, meeting existing regulatory requirements. However, the software update offers a demonstrably lower residual risk. What is the most appropriate course of action according to ISO 14971 Principles for Medical Device Risk Management? Option A. Implement the software update immediately without further analysis, prioritizing the reduction of residual risk regardless of cost or potential impact on other device functions. Option B. Maintain the current risk control, as it is already deemed acceptable and meets regulatory requirements, and avoid the significant development and validation costs of the software update. Option C. Implement the software update after a thorough reevaluation of the residual risk, a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis that quantifies safety benefits, and confirmation that it does not introduce new hazards. Option D. Defer the decision on the software update until the current risk control becomes demonstrably less effective or a regulatory mandate requires its implementation. Correct answer is C. Implement the software update after a thorough reevaluation of the residual risk, a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis that quantifies safety benefits, and confirmation that it does not introduce new hazards. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in medical device risk management, balancing the effectiveness of a risk control option with its practical implementation and cost. The introduction of a new, potentially more effective risk control measure, software update, necessitates a thorough evaluation against existing, less effective but established controls. The challenge lies in determining if the incremental benefit of the new control justifies the investment and potential disruption, while ensuring that patient safety remains paramount and regulatory requirements are met. Decision-maker must consider not only the technical efficacy, but also the broader implications for the device's lifecycle, user training, and the overall risk management process, as defined by ISO 14971. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive assessment of the proposed software update as a risk control option, aligning with the principles of ISO 14971. This includes re-evaluating the residual risk after implementing the software update, considering its effectiveness in reducing the identified hazard. Crucially, it requires a thorough cost-benefit analysis that goes beyond mere financial cost to include the benefits of enhanced safety, potential reduction in adverse events, and compliance with evolving regulatory expectations. The decision to implement the software update should be based on whether it demonstrably reduces the risk to an acceptable level, considering the residual risk of the current system and the feasibility and impact of the new control. This aligns with the iterative nature of risk management, where new information or technologies prompt a review and potential update of risk controls. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to dismiss the software update solely because the current risk control is deemed acceptable by the manufacturer, without a formal re-evaluation of residual risk. This fails to embrace the principle of continuous improvement inherent in risk management and ISO 14971, which encourages seeking more effective risk reduction measures. It also overlooks the potential for the current control to become less effective over time or for regulatory expectations to change. Another incorrect approach would be to implement the software update without a proper cost-benefit analysis, especially if the financial cost is perceived as high, without adequately quantifying the benefits of reduced risk. This could lead to an inefficient allocation of resources and potentially a failure to implement a control that would significantly enhance patient safety. It prioritizes financial considerations over the primary objective of risk reduction. A third incorrect approach would be to implement the software update without considering its impact on other aspects of the device's performance or user interface. This could inadvertently introduce new hazards or usability issues, negating the intended benefit of the risk control. A holistic view of the risk management process, considering all potential impacts, is essential. Professional reasoning. Professionals faced with this decision should follow a structured risk management process. This involves 1. Clearly defining the hazard and the current risk control. 2. Evaluating the proposed new risk control software update for its technical feasibility and effectiveness in reducing the specific hazard. 3. Conducting a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis, considering not only financial costs but also the benefits of improved safety, reduced liability, and enhanced device reputation. 4. Re-evaluating the residual risk after the proposed control is implemented. 5. Documenting the entire process, including the rationale for the decision, in accordance with ISO 14971 requirements. The ultimate decision should prioritize patient safety and the reduction of risk to an acceptable level, guided by regulatory requirements and ethical considerations. Question 19. The risk matrix shows a moderate severity rating for a potential hazard associated with a new surgical instrument. The risk management team is considering the use of historical data from similar, but not identical, instruments and published literature on surgical complications. Which approach best utilizes this information for a robust risk analysis? Option A. Exclude all historical data and literature, relying solely on expert opinion and simulated failure modes, as past data may not accurately reflect the performance of the new instrument. Option B. Critically evaluate the relevance and applicability of the historical data and literature to the specific surgical instrument, considering factors like design differences, intended use, and the time period of the data, and integrate findings with appropriate justification. Option C. Prioritize readily available historical data from the manufacturer's previous product lines, assuming it is directly transferable to the new instrument without further validation. Option D. Include all published literature and historical data without critical assessment, assuming that any mention of a hazard indicates a significant risk for the new instrument. The correct answer is B. Critically evaluate the relevance and applicability of the historical data and literature to the specific surgical instrument, considering factors like design differences, intended use, and the time period of the data, and integrate findings with appropriate justification. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in medical device risk management. effectively integrating diverse sources of information to accurately assess risk. The professional challenge lies in discerning the relevance, reliability, and applicability of historical data and literature, which can be varied in quality and context, to the specific device under evaluation. A careful judgment is required to avoid over-reliance on potentially outdated or irrelevant information, or conversely, underestimating risks due to incomplete data. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it emphasizes a systematic and critical evaluation of all available data. By considering the source, methodology, and applicability of historical data and literature, the risk management team ensures that the risk analysis is grounded in evidence that is relevant to the current device and its intended use. This aligns with the principles of ISO 14971, which mandates a thorough and documented risk analysis process. Ethically, this approach prioritizes patient safety by striving for the most accurate risk assessment possible, thereby enabling appropriate risk control measures. An incorrect approach that relies solely on readily available but potentially outdated or irrelevant historical data fails to acknowledge the dynamic nature of medical device technology and clinical practice. This can lead to an underestimation of risks, as new failure modes or use errors may not be captured. Ethically, this is a failure to exercise due diligence in protecting patient safety. Another incorrect approach that dismisses all historical data and literature in favor of purely theoretical or simulated data ignores valuable real-world insights. This can lead to an overestimation of risks or the overlooking of known failure modes that have been documented in practice, potentially leading to unnecessary design changes or an inefficient allocation of resources. This also represents an ethical failure to leverage all available knowledge to achieve an optimal risk-benefit balance. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with clearly defining the scope of the risk analysis for the specific medical device. This involves identifying potential hazards and hazardous situations. Subsequently, they should conduct a comprehensive search for relevant historical data and literature, critically appraising the quality, applicability, and limitations of each source. This appraisal should consider factors such as the similarity of the device, the patient population, the clinical environment, and the time frame of the data. The findings from this evaluation should then be integrated into the risk analysis, with clear justification for their inclusion or exclusion. This iterative process ensures that the risk assessment is robust, evidence-based, and ultimately supports the development of safe and effective medical devices. Question 20. Compliance review shows that a medical device manufacturer is implementing its post-market surveillance plan. Which of the following methods for collecting post-market data represents the most comprehensive and effective approach for identifying potential risks and ensuring ongoing device safety? Option A. Prioritizing only data that directly confirms the device's intended performance and efficacy, while disregarding any information suggesting deviations. Option B. Actively soliciting feedback from healthcare professionals and patients, systematically reviewing regulatory complaint databases, and monitoring scientific literature for relevant studies. Option C. Relying solely on passive complaint logging by users without any proactive outreach or engagement. Option D. Focusing exclusively on data generated from internal quality control checks performed during manufacturing. The correct answer is B. Actively soliciting feedback from healthcare professionals and patients, systematically reviewing regulatory complaint databases, and monitoring scientific literature for relevant studies. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in medical device risk management, effectively gathering and utilizing post-market data to ensure ongoing device safety and performance. The challenge lies in the diverse sources of this data, the varying reliability and completeness of information from each source, and the need to integrate this disparate information into a coherent risk assessment process. Professionals must exercise careful judgment to identify truly significant signals of potential harm amidst background noise, and to prioritize actions based on the evidence. The regulatory expectation is not just data collection, but its systematic analysis and integration into the risk management file. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a multifaceted approach to post-market data collection that prioritizes sources with direct clinical relevance and established reporting mechanisms. This includes actively soliciting feedback from healthcare professionals and patients, leveraging regulatory complaint databases, and monitoring scientific literature for relevant studies. This comprehensive strategy ensures that a wide spectrum of potential issues is captured, from minor usability concerns to serious adverse events. By systematically analyzing data from these diverse sources, manufacturers can identify trends, assess the severity and frequency of potential hazards, and implement timely corrective and preventive actions, thereby fulfilling their ongoing regulatory obligations for risk management and demonstrating a commitment to patient safety. This aligns with the principles of ISO 14971, which emphasizes the need for continuous risk assessment throughout the device lifecycle. Incorrect approaches analysis, relying solely on passive complaint logging without proactive outreach, fails to capture a significant portion of real-world device performance and user experience. Many users may not formally report issues, leading to an incomplete picture of potential risks. This approach is ethically questionable, as it neglects a duty to actively seek out and address potential safety concerns. Focusing exclusively on data from internal quality control checks overlooks the critical insights gained from actual clinical use. Internal checks, while important, do not replicate the complexities and variations of real-world environments, potentially missing emergent risks. This is a regulatory failure, as it does not fulfill the requirement for post-market surveillance of the device as used by intended users. Prioritizing only data that directly confirms the device's intended performance, while ignoring any data that suggests deviations or potential issues, represents a significant bias. This approach is ethically unsound, as it deliberately filters out information that could indicate a safety risk, thereby compromising patient well-being. It is also a direct violation of regulatory requirements for unbiased risk assessment. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic and proactive approach to post-market data collection. This involves establishing clear procedures for receiving, documenting, and analyzing all forms of post-market information. The decision-making process should be guided by the principles of ISO 14971, focusing on the identification, evaluation, and control of risks. When evaluating data sources, professionals should consider their relevance, reliability, and potential to reveal safety or performance issues. A critical mindset is essential, questioning assumptions and actively seeking corroborating evidence. Prioritization of actions should be based on the assessed risk, with a clear emphasis on addressing issues that could impact patient safety. Regular review and updates to the risk management file are paramount, ensuring that the risk assessment remains current and reflects the latest available information.